The street was quiet at dawn, not the gentle quiet of a sleeping neighborhood, but something deeper, something that pressed against the ears like cotton, like the world itself was holding its breath before releasing it all at once. The kind of quiet that comes before things change forever, the kind that settles into your bones and makes you pay attention even when you don't know what you're paying attention to. Eleanor Hayes stood on her porch in the gray morning light, a cup of coffee cooling between her palms, and watched the sun come up over the Oklahoma plains the way she had watched it come up for 53 years from this exact spot. The light moved slow and golden across the flat earth, touching the rooftops of the houses she knew by heart. The Callaway place with its perfect white shutters that Margaret Callaway repainted every spring without fail. The Nolan house with the tire swing hanging from the old oak tree that had been there longer than Eleanor had the Brannigan property at the end of the block, with the satellite dish that had been tilted the same wrong direction for 11 years. She had watched them put it up. She had watched it tilt. She had watched 11 winters come and go without anyone fixing it, and she had come to regard it as a fixed point, a landmark as reliable in its imperfection as anything else on the street. She knew every house on this street, knew the people inside them, knew their habits and their histories, in the particular way each of them had of standing at their own front doors on summer evenings. She had baked Christmas cookies for every single family, every December, without exception. Even the years when money was so tight she bought flour and sugar on credit from the grocery on Clement Street and paid it back in February when the pension check arrived with a small cost of living adjustment that felt like a gift every single time. She had watched children grow up on this block and move away and come back with children of their own. She had attended funerals and graduations, in one memorable 4th of July block party in 1987 where Raymond had burned the hamburgers so completely that they had laughed about it for years afterward. Every summer, the running joke that never stopped being funny, because it had been so thoroughly, so perfectly Raymond, his absolute confidence going in and his absolute bewilderment at the result. The coffee was good. It was always good. She made it the same way Raymond had taught her in 1965, 2 spoons of grounds more than the can recommended a pinch of salt to cut the bitterness water just off the boil, because boiling water made it bitter in a different way. 60 years of the same morning ritual, the same proportions, the same sequence of small actions performed in the same order. The kitchen might be different now, smaller somehow, without his presence filling it. The space he had occupied, leaving behind a shape she still navigated around without thinking. Stepping to the left at the counter, the way she always had to give him room that no longer needed giving. But the coffee was the same. She did not go inside when the cup was empty. She stood on the porch a while longer, her right hand resting on the railing Raymond had built, feeling the wood soft and yielding beneath her palm, the rot working through it, the way age works through everything, patient and inevitable and without malice. The paint on the railing was the color of old teeth. 7 places on the roof caught water when it rained, and she had learned the position of every one of them, had learned the choreography of setting out the right container in the right place before a storm. A pot here, a bowl there, the blue bucket in the corner of the bedroom that she had to remember to empty before it reached the rim. She had perfected this choreography over years of practice. It was not the life she had imagined, but it was the life she had, and she had long since stopped measuring it against imagined alternatives. The house was falling apart. She had known it for a long time. She knew it the way you know things that you cannot immediately fix, with a kind of steady, patient acknowledgement, a daily reckoning that did not tip into despair, because despair was a luxury she had never been able to afford. But it was Raymond's house. He had built it with his own hands starting in 1951, just back from Korea. Just back from things he never talked about, carrying something in the set of his shoulders, and the occasional distance in his eyes that she had learned to read and learned to move around with the same care she gave the space at the counter. He had worked on the house for 20 years in the evenings and on weekends while he held down his job at the hardware store on Meridian Avenue, and he had finished it in 1971 and stood back and looked at it with an expression Eleanor had never seen on his face before or since. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride, something that looked like a man setting down a weight he had carried for a very long distance over very difficult terrain. "This is ours," he had said. His voice had been the voice he used for serious things. "Nobody can take this from us." He had been wrong about that, but he had not known it then, and she had believed him with the complete faith of a woman who had watched him build something solid out of his own two hands. And for 53 years, she had kept on believing him through the sheer force of will. Paying the mortgage on time through decades of careful accounting, penny by careful penny calculating and recalculating. Making the numbers work by not wasting anything. By being precise in the way that people who cannot afford imprecision learn to be. Until 18 months ago, when her body started costing more than she had anticipated, the prescriptions multiplying, the copays adding up to sums that didn't leave room for the mortgage payment of $840 a wall, she could not climb no matter how many times she tried to find a foothold. She had called the bank 17 times. 17 times the same voice Gerald Fitch, loan officer, Riverside First National Bank, had answered with the measured patience of a man who had learned to keep all human feeling carefully separated from his professional function, who had built a wall between himself and the consequences of what he was required to say. "We've been patient, Mrs. Hayes. The foreclosure process is final. There are resources available to help you transition to more appropriate housing for your situation." More appropriate housing. She had looked around Raymond's kitchen when he said those words at the window above the sink where the morning light came in at the same angle every day and had been coming in at that angle for 50 years, at the hook beside the back door where his jacket had hung for 30 years after he stopped needing it, the leather worn to a particular softness in the places where his hands had touched it most often. More appropriate housing for her situation. She had thanked him and hung up. Not because she felt thankful, because Raymond had raised her to be polite to people even when politeness cost her something, and she had made it a practice for so long it had become automatic courtesy, as second nature courtesy, as the last thing you give away. The eviction notice had arrived on a Tuesday. She had seen the envelope in the mailbox from the porch and known what it was before she touched it. The way you know certain things in your body before your mind catches up, the way she had known about Raymond's heart attack, before the ambulance arrived, standing at the kitchen window, watching him in the garden, and feeling something go still inside her chest, some deep animal knowing preceding knowledge. She had brought the envelope inside and set it on the kitchen table and made a cup of coffee and sat down. She had given herself the coffee before opening it because she understood that what was inside required the small comfort of something warm in her hands. Then she had opened it. 5 days to vacate the premises, 5 days to gather 53 years of living and reduce it to whatever would fit in the back of a car she didn't own, to find some arrangement that didn't yet exist to solve a problem that had no clear solution with resources she didn't have. The language was clean and legal and completely indifferent to the fact that she had raised 2 children in this house, had buried a husband from this house, had spent 32 years alone in this house, holding the shape of a marriage, the way you hold water in cupped hands, losing a little every year to evaporation, but never letting go, never tipping your hands. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and set it on the table beside her coffee cup. That was when she saw the second envelope. It had been tucked behind the eviction notice, smaller, cream-colored, from a law office she didn't recognize. Marsh, Dallow and Associates. The name meant nothing to her immediately. She almost set it aside to open later, but something made her open it, then some cold instinct, the same instinct that had brought her to the window to look at Raymond in the garden. It took her 3 readings to understand what she was looking at. 6 months ago, someone had purchased her secondary mortgage from the original lending institution. The note had changed hands in a transaction she had not been notified of, had not been aware of, had had no opportunity to respond to. The new holder of the debt had the legal right to accelerate the foreclosure timeline under certain default conditions, and those conditions had been met, and the new holder of the debt was exercising that right fully and without exception. The new holder of the debt was Vivian Marsh. Eleanor sat very still with the letter in her hands. Through the kitchen window, she could see across the street to where Vivian's colonial house sat, immaculate and white in the morning light, its shutters perfectly painted, its lawn edged with mathematical precision, its flower beds planted with the coordinated colors of someone who had both the money and the time to pay close attention to such things. The house that had never in 15 years had a shingle out of place. She had known Vivian Marsh for those 15 years, had watched her move into the colonial house with her husband and her matching luggage and her careful measured smile, and had gone across the street 3 days after she arrived with a casserole dish and an apple pie. Because that was what Eleanor Hayes did when someone moved onto her street, had always done, it would do it again. They had sat on Vivian's porch that first afternoon and talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular. The easy exploratory talk of two women learning the shape of each other, finding the edges and the openings and the places where conversation flowed naturally. 3 years into the acquaintance, Vivian had come to Eleanor's door on a gray February afternoon with a particular expression that Eleanor had recognized immediately from decades of watching people carry things they were ashamed of needing to put down. "My husband and I are going through a difficult time," Vivian had said, "financially. I hate to ask. I know we don't know each other well enough for this." Eleanor had given her $3,000 in cash without hesitation. It was money she had been setting aside for the roof. She had asked for nothing in return except repayment when things improved. No interest, no formal agreement, no timeline. Just one person looking at another person in need and extending a hand. Vivian had repaid the money 18 months later, every dollar delivered in an envelope slipped through the mail slot on a Thursday morning without a note, without a knock, without so much as a word. Eleanor had found the envelope, counted the money, and thought that was the end of it. Had felt nothing but a quiet satisfaction that things had worked out. She had not understood until this moment, reading this letter at her kitchen table, that it had not been the end of it at all. That Vivian Marsh had spent 12 years unable to forgive Eleanor for witnessing her vulnerability, unable to forgive a kindness that had required her to ask for help, to be seen in difficulty, to be indebted even temporarily to a neighbor whose house was falling apart. The petition with 37 signatures had not been about property values. The cold civic language about dangerous structures and neighborhood standards and the impact on the community had not been about the roof or the rotting porch railing or the peeling paint. It had been about erasing a debt that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with pride. Eleanor folded the letter carefully along its creases and placed it in the pocket of her house dress alongside the eviction notice. She finished her coffee. She washed the cup and set it on the drying rack. She went to the window and looked across the street. Vivian was on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching Eleanor's house, with an expression of settled, patient satisfaction that confirmed everything the letter had said without saying it. The expression of a person who has waited for something for a long time and is finally watching it arrive. Eleanor stood at the window and looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned away and went about her morning. She called the bank one more time that afternoon, the 18th call. She told Fitch about the letter. He was quiet for a moment, the professional quiet of a man receiving information he is reorganizing into the categories his job requires. "The transaction is a matter of public record. Mrs. Hayes," he said finally, "the bank cannot control secondary market activity. The foreclosure timeline remains unchanged. There is nothing we can do at this point." She thanked him and hung up. She sat for a moment at the kitchen table with the phone in her hands and looked at the window where the afternoon light was doing what it always did at this hour, falling at that particular angle. And she thought about the fact that this light had been falling at this angle in this window for 53 years, and that the light itself didn't know anything was wrong, and she found this oddly comforting. The next 3 days passed with the terrible slowness of time that is running out each hour, weighted with its own finality. She called the housing assistance number on the back of the eviction notice and listened to a recorded message. She called the senior services line and was placed on hold for 40 minutes before the call dropped. She called her daughter in Tucson, who cried and said she would figure something out, and they both knew she would not in 5 days. Not with 2 kids and a mortgage of her own and the kind of life that doesn't have room for emergencies that don't belong to it. She called her son in Columbus, who didn't answer, and called back 3 hours later with a tightness in his voice that told her the call had been preceded by a conversation with his wife, a conversation she could reconstruct accurately from the tone of his voice alone. She slept in the kitchen those 3 nights because it was the only room the failing furnace still heated adequately. She slept in Raymond's reading chair with a blanket pulled up to her chin and the kitchen light on because the dark felt different now, felt like something that was closing in rather than simply the absence of light. On the fourth morning, she woke to a sky the wrong color. She had lived through 60 tornado seasons in Oklahoma. She had been through enough of them to know the warning signs the way she knew her own body, by the particular quality of wrongness that preceded the worst of them. The sky that morning was doing the thing she had learned to fear most, turning a color that had no proper name somewhere between green and copper, and the color of old brass left too long in a damp place. A light that seemed to emanate from inside objects rather than falling on their surfaces. The air had thickened overnight. The usual sounds of the morning were absent. The birds had stopped. She turned on the kitchen radio, and the emergency broadcast was already running, the mechanical voice moving through its list of coordinates and warnings with the flat urgency it reserved for real events. EF5 possible. Strongest system in 30 years. Seek shelter immediately. This is not a drill. Seek shelter immediately. Eleanor looked at her basement door. The hinges had rusted sometime in the last decade, gone from silver to a deep flaking orange. The door made a sound like something in pain when she pulled it, a prolonged metallic protest that she had been meaning to fix and had not fixed, one of the many small repairs deferred until they became simply the texture of the house accepted and incorporated. She stood at the top of the stairs and looked down into the dimness at the wooden stairs Raymond had built in 1952. The year after he came home working alone in the summer heat with the focused intensity of a man who needed to be building something solid. He had built these stairs to last. Most of them had. The third step had been missing for 4 years since the wood finally gave way. She had put a piece of tape on the riser above it as a reminder. The tape long since faded. The fifth step had a crack running its full width. A crack she tested every time she used the stairs, pressing her weight onto it carefully, waiting to feel it flex, feeling it flex, stepping past it quickly. Stepping. The bare bulb at the bottom threw its familiar yellow cone of light across the shelves of old canning jars and Christmas decorations in their labeled boxes, and the folded army blanket on the third shelf that had been there for 30 years, placed there by Raymond and never moved by Eleanor, kept, because keeping it was the closest thing to an explanation she had ever received for what he carried. She heard the pressure change in the air before she heard the engines. The engines came next, the deep mechanical rumble from around the corner building as it approached, and she stepped off the porch onto the cracked front path and looked toward the sound and watched 25 motorcycles come around the corner in a formation that tightened as they came down her block. The riders moving with the unconscious coordination of people who had ridden together enough miles to share a sense of the road. They wore black leather that had been worn to the point where it had become something more than clothing, something that bore the character of long use, the patches and chains moving with the motion of the machines. In the strange copper-green light of the advancing storm, the chrome on each bike caught and scattered brightness in fragments. Iron Covenant arched across each jacket in silver thread that caught the light with a particular sharpness, and below it a crest she couldn't make out from the distance she was standing. Across the street, Vivian Marsh's front door opened and closed so quickly it might have been a reflex. Eleanor heard other doors too, the sounds of houses closing themselves. Curtains pulled windows checked the street, performing its own small shuddering, as if the sight of the motorcycles were itself a kind of storm. The street emptied, and Eleanor stood on her front path and did not move. The lead rider was a large man in the way that some men are large not from vanity or effort, but from the simple accumulation of decades of physical life, the solid, settled weight of a man who had worked with his body for a long time and whose body showed it. He was perhaps 60 with a gray beard braided with strips of leather cord that moved slightly in the thickening wind, and arms covered in tattoos that disappeared under his sleeves and told stories she couldn't read from where she stood. He swung off the bike with the ease of a man for whom motorcycles were simply how the world was moved through, pulled off his helmet, and looked at Eleanor with eyes that were unexpectedly and completely gentle. She noticed his hands before she noticed much else about him. They were the hands of a man who fixed things, who understood the interior workings of objects, who had spent a long life knowing what things were made of and how to put them back together when they came apart. Ma'am, his voice was quieter than she had expected, calibrated to not alarm the voice of a large man who had learned that his size preceded him and had made peace with adjusting for it. We got caught out here. Storms coming fast. He paused, and she could see him working through how to say what he needed to say. The brief internal calculation of a person asking for something from a stranger. Is there any chance you have somewhere we could shelter? The tornado siren started, then the county-wide system coming on in sequence. The awful undulating wail rising and falling in a sound that had never lost its effect on her, that still moved something ancient and animal in her chest, regardless of how many times she had heard it. She looked at the man. She looked at the 24 men still on their bikes, watching her with the faces of people who understood the situation had become serious and were hoping for something specific. She did not think about Vivian. She did not calculate. She did not perform any version of the risk assessment that the situation viewed from a certain angle might have seemed to require. She saw 25 people who needed shelter. Basement, she said. Her voice carried, without her needing to raise it, the voice of a woman who had spent 8 decades saying things that needed to be heard. Through the kitchen. Watch the 3rd step, it's missing. 5th step has a crack, but it'll hold if you don't stop on it. The man's eyes changed in a way she noticed but couldn't have named. Ma'am, there's 25 of us, he said. Then you better move, Eleanor said. Storm's not going to wait on us. They came through her kitchen in a line that took several minutes to complete, filling the small space with the smell of rain and engine oil, and the particular worn leather smell of people who spent a lot of time outdoors, and beneath all of that, the same human warmth that underlies all human smells, the warmth that is recognizable regardless of what covers it. Their boots on her linoleum made a sound like something drumming. They were careful in the way that large people in small spaces learn to be careful, ducking under the kitchen light, turning sideways through the doorway, pressing against walls to let each other through their consideration for the space. Surprising her, and then on reflection, not surprising her at all. The leader went last. He stood at the top of the basement stairs and looked down and then looked at Eleanor. Cole Decker, he said. He said it with the weight that men of a certain generation give to names, as if a name is not just a label, but a thing of substance, a commitment. Eleanor Hayes, she said. He nodded once, receiving this, then choosing his words with care. Can I help you down, Mrs. Hayes? She took his arm because it was offered in good faith, and because the stairs were genuinely treacherous, and because there was no wisdom in refusing practical help on principle when the principle wasn't worth the risk. His arm was solid under her hand in the way that takes years to build. The basement was not designed for 26 people. It was designed for canning jars and Christmas decorations and one army blanket and whatever privacy a person needed to keep. The men pressed together shoulder to shoulder, their leather creaking, their breathing falling gradually into the synchronization that happens naturally when people share a small enclosed space for any length of time, the respiratory rhythm of a group adapting to shared air. Their motorcycles were outside, sitting in a row in the copper-green light. Nothing to be done about that. The single bulb swung on its wire. Dust moved from the joists in thin streams. Through the small ground-level window, she watched the sky go from green to a darkness that was not night's darkness, but something more deliberate, as if something enormous had positioned itself between the land and the light. She heard it begin below the range of audible sound, felt it in her chest before her ears registered it, the way you feel large machinery before you hear it. Then it grew, became a roar, became something that stopped being sound and became instead a condition. The air itself transformed into pressure and into force and into the particular violence that tornadoes have of reorganizing everything they touch without regard for what those things mean to the people who arrange them. The walls shook. Plaster dust came down in streams fine enough to turn the air white. The bulbs swung in arcs that grew wider and then wilder, and threw the shadows of 26 people across the curved walls in moving shapes. Something struck the house above them, something massive, and the floor above their heads, bowed downward, visibly held bowed again. She heard wood splitting. She heard glass. She heard sounds she couldn't identify, the sounds of a house being rearranged against its will. She heard nearby a metallic rhythmic sound and turned toward it. The youngest of them stood pressed against the wall to her left. He couldn't have been more than 25 years old. His face beneath the leather and the patches and the practiced exterior of toughness that young men construct was the face of a young man meeting something his courage was not yet large enough to contain. His hands were shaking badly enough that the rings he wore on 3 fingers were rattling against each other in a continuous involuntary percussion. Eleanor moved through the press of bodies to reach him. This required patience and the cooperation of several large men who flattened themselves against the walls to make room, which they did without being asked, reading what she was doing and making space for it. "First tornado," she said. He nodded. His jaw was set hard. "What's your name, Danny?" The word came out unsteady at the edges. She took his hand. Her hand was small and the skin across the knuckles was thin as paper. And his hand was enormous, a young man's strong hand that was shaking despite itself, despite everything he might prefer. She held it firmly. "Close your eyes," she said. "Find somewhere quiet in your head. A morning you remember that was good. Your mother's kitchen, maybe, if that's a good memory. A road you drove once when the weather was right and the music was right. Anything that belongs to you. Just breathe with me. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Don't listen to the noise. Listen to your own breathing." Above them, the world came apart. She had sheltered from tornadoes in this basement before, alone with Raymond once with the children, when they were small. She had never been in one of this size, had never experienced the roar climbing to the point where sound became something else entirely, a physical pressure that pushed against her eardrums and her rib cage simultaneously that made her teeth ache. Something else hit the house above them, something that transferred its impact through the floor joists and into the concrete beneath their feet, a shudder that ran through 26 bodies at once. She heard Cole Decker's voice somewhere behind her, steady and low. Impossible to make out the words over the roar, but the tone carrying exactly what a tone needs to carry. In that moment, the signal that someone is present and functioning and intends to remain so. Danny's hand stopped shaking by degrees, the trembling subsiding the way a struck bell gradually stops vibrating, his breathing slowing over several minutes to something more regular. Matching hers without his being aware of it, the body's natural tendency to synchronize with the breath it is closest to. She closed her own eyes and thought about Raymond. She thought about him pouring this concrete floor in 1952, working alone in the August heat with the methodical focus of a man who understood that foundations were not things you hurried. She thought about his hands on the concrete forms, his precise and patient hands, and she thought that 32 years after his death, he was still here in the way that matters, still present in the structure of this place, still keeping his promise to hold her safe in the house he had built for exactly this purpose, among others. She had thought sometimes in the years since he died that the house was all she had left of him. She was beginning to understand in this moment, in this particular darkness, that she had it backwards. He was all she had left of the house, and the house was merely the form that taking. The roar peaked, held, then began impossibly to diminish. The silence that followed arrived all at once, pressing against ears that had adapted to the roar. A silence so complete it had physical presence. The silence of a world that has just been through something and is now accounting for what remains. Eleanor opened her eyes. The bulb still swung. Dust hung suspended, uncertain of direction. 26 people breathed. Cole moved to the stairs after a full minute of stillness. He pressed against the basement door and it didn't move. He set his shoulder against it and shoved, and the debris above it shifted without giving way. 3 more men joined him, and on the count of 3, they threw their combined weight against it, and the door burst open and a cascade of material came down the stairs. Wood and shingles and insulation and things she couldn't identify. The inventory of the house above recategorized into debris. Cole came up first and stood at the top of the stairs for a moment before he turned back to help her up. She saw something move across his face while he was turned away from her and controlled before he turned back. He helped her up one step at a time, one hand under her elbow, and brought her out into the open air. Her kitchen was gone. The word doesn't quite cover what had happened. The kitchen had not collapsed or been damaged. It had been removed. Where the room had been, there was now open sky, Oklahoma, sky blue and clean and indifferent as only skies can be after they have done something terrible. One interior wall remained standing, the wall between the kitchen and the hallway, and on it, untouched and unmoved, and surrounded on all sides by destruction, hung the row of photographs she had put up in 1989. Raymond and her at their daughter's college graduation. A Christmas morning from the early 70s, the children on the stairs in their pajamas. Raymond in his Army uniform at 22, the photograph taken before he shipped out to Korea, before whatever happened there that he sealed away in the negative space of 30 years of marriage. She did not understand how the photographs had survived. She stood and looked at them and did not understand it, and then stopped trying to understand it, and simply accepted it the way she had learned to accept things that were true without requiring them to be explicable. She looked at what remained of the rest of the house. Her kitchen table, the one she and Raymond had bought at an estate sale in 1969 for $12, because they were furnishing the house on nothing and were proud of every bargain, was standing upright in the middle of the street as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Her refrigerator was 30 feet away with its door open. The aluminum body of Raymond's old floor lamp was bent around the trunk of the oak tree in the front yard. The Purple Heart was in the back bedroom, where the back bedroom had been. She moved through the debris herself, not asking for help, stepping over beams and around sections of collapsed wall, following the map in her body of where everything had been. The bedroom she had shared with Raymond for 27 years, the nightstand with the drawer that stuck the small wooden box Raymond had made to hold the metal fitted to the metal shape, as if he had designed it specifically to prevent the metal from moving around from making any noise. The nightstand was gone. The wall was gone. She stood on bare concrete under open sky and felt the specific dislocation of knowing exactly where you are while nothing around you confirms it. She found the metal in the mud at the edge of what remained of the foundation, the purple ribbon dark with mud, almost black. She cleaned it on the hem of her house dress, working methodically until the brass was visible, until Washington's profile emerged from beneath the mud, until the Latin words she had read 10,000 times were legible again. It came clean because Raymond had kept it clean, and that habit of care had outlasted him. She was still holding it when Vivian spoke. Well, Vivian Marsh stood across the street in her immaculate yard, her colonial house behind her, without a single shingle displaced, not one cracked window pane, as if the tornado had made a deliberate decision about which properties on this block deserved to survive. She was holding her phone up, recording. Her voice carried across the wreckage with the carrying quality of a voice that has learned to be heard. This is what happens when you make poor choices, Dorothy. Eleanor noted the wrong name. Vivian had called her Dorothy. She had never called her that before. It meant something, the wrong name, something about what Vivian had become in this moment, the way certainty of a particular kind makes people careless about small details. Those criminals you let into our neighborhood. This is God's own judgment, Eleanor. This is consequences finding their proper address. Doors opened along the street. The Nolans, the Brannigans, Tessa Nolan, whom Eleanor had known since Tessa was a girl of 7 who had lost her job 2 years ago, and whose children Eleanor had minded for 8 months without charge, because Tessa had needed someone to, and Eleanor had been available, and had not considered it a sacrifice. They stood on their porches in a row and watched. Not one of them crossed the street. Not one voice called out to ask if she was hurt, if she needed anything, if she was all right. Cole Decker stood a few feet behind Eleanor. She could hear him breathing, the controlled, deliberate breathing of a man managing something that wants to be larger than he is allowing it to be. She turned and looked at his hands. They were curled at his sides, and then released, and then curled again, the hands of a man doing arithmetic on his anger. "It's all right," she said quietly. It was not all right. She was not pretending it was. She was simply choosing not to respond to cruelty with its own currency, a choice she had made early in her life and had not unmade since a choice that had cost her things over the years and that she did not regret. The bank's black SUV arrived 20 minutes later, the Riverside First National logo on the door catching the strange post-storm light. Gerald Fitch stepped out with the careful precision of a man who considered his shoes an investment, navigating the debris with his eyes fixed on a middle distance that allowed him to be present without fully looking at what was in front of him. Mrs. Hayes. The professional neutrality of his voice was something she had heard 17 times before and recognized completely the neutrality of a man who has separated his conscience from his function by long practice. I'm very sorry about this situation. However, given the extensive structural damage and the resulting liability to the bank's interests, we're going to need to accelerate the timeline. You have 48 hours to vacate the property. Demolition crew is scheduled for Monday morning 6 a.m. sharp. He set it to a point approximately 2 feet above her left shoulder, still not looking at her directly. Cole took one step forward. His voice, when it came, was controlled in the way that very controlled anger is controlled, which is to say that the control itself was frightening. Mrs. Hayes lost her home 2 hours ago, he said. She nearly died. We all nearly died. And you're here to tell her she has less time than she had this morning. It creates a safety hazard and a liability issue for the bank. Fitch said, finally looking at Cole, the look lasting precisely as long as it took him to assess what he was looking at and decide he would rather not. 48 hours, Mrs. Hayes. Non-negotiable. He got back in the SUV and drove away. He did not ask if she was hurt. Eleanor stood in the mud of what had been Raymond's front yard, Raymond's Purple Heart in her right hand, the eviction notice and Vivian's letter in her pocket, 48 hours between her and nothing she could identify. The neighbors were still on their porches. None of them moved. Cole came to stand beside her. They were quiet together for a moment, looking at what remained. We're not done here, Cole said. Something had settled into his voice, something decided. Eleanor looked up at him. He was a large man in the afternoon light, a man with his father's photograph somewhere in his past that he didn't yet know, connected to this street and this woman in this particular afternoon in a way that would reorganize everything. Son, she said. She meant it with the full weight of the word, the tenderness it carried when it was used correctly. You don't owe me anything. You needed shelter, and I had shelter. That's all this was. He looked at her for a long time with an expression she didn't have an exact name for, an expression that reminded her in its quality of private reckoning of Raymond's face the afternoon he finished the house and stood back and looked at it. With respect, ma'am, he said. That's not all this was. He didn't say what he meant. He put on his helmet and mounted his bike, and one by one the other machines came to life around him until the street was full of sound. And then they rode away down the debris-scattered road, and Eleanor stood alone in the ruins of Raymond's yard and watched them go. The afternoon light was ordinary and golden. The post-storm light that Oklahoma does. Sometimes the sky scrubbed to a luminosity that makes everything look more itself than usual. The birds had come back. Someone down the block had turned on a radio, and she could hear the emergency broadcast cycling through its coordinates in the measured voice of someone whose job is to describe disaster in geographical terms. She stood and held the medal and looked at the wall with the photographs at Raymond at 22, at the man who would spend the next 20 years building a house for her, and never mention the other things he had done in the years before they met. She had loved him for 59 years, the last 32 without his being present, and she had never once experienced this as a tragedy. It had been a privilege of the most ordinary and extraordinary kind, the privilege of having been loved well by a man who showed it in wood and concrete rather than in words, in the third step reinforced in the basement dug deep in the particular yellow he had chosen for the paint, after 3 tries because he wanted it to be exactly right. She reached up with both hands and took his photograph from the wall. She held it against her chest and stood in the ruins of the house he had built. And the afternoon was beautiful in the way afternoons can be beautiful after terrible things. Luminous and clean and completely indifferent to what had just been lost. 48 hours. She needed to find somewhere to sleep before the dark came. The Red Cross shelter on Fifth Street occupied the ground floor of what had been an Elks Lodge, a building that still wore its previous purpose in the bones of its architecture. The high ceilings and wide floors, now fitted with rows of cots and fluorescent lighting, and the institutional smell of disinfectant and mass habitation. The smell reached her before she got through the door. The particular compound smell of many people in temporary proximity, not unpleasant but unmistakably belonging to emergency, to the condition of things not yet resolved. Eleanor was assigned cot number 47. It was in the third row from the far wall, positioned between a family of 6, whose youngest had been crying with the relentless commitment of a very young child who has not yet learned to stop, and an elderly man who coughed through the night in long, wet intervals. A cough with a particular sound that told her it had been living in his chest for some time and intended to stay. The cot had a vinyl-covered mattress that made a sound when she moved, and a wool blanket folded at the foot that carried in its fibers the ghost of someone else's household, someone else's laundry detergent and domestic warmth. Carol Sims was the shelter coordinator, a woman of perhaps 55 with kind eyes and the posture of someone who has spent years in work that requires her to be present with people at their worst moments. A posture that was not defeated, but simply redistributed. The weight of it, absorbed and carried differently than most people carry weight. She handed Eleanor the plastic bag with both hands. The way you give something to a person when you want the giving to carry more than the object itself can carry. Inside a toothbrush, still in its packaging, travel-sized toothpaste, a small bottle of generic shampoo, and a change of donated clothing that did not belong to Eleanor's size, or era pants 4 inches too long, and a sweater so large that it rearranged itself around her body as she stood, belonging to the proportions of someone considerably larger. 3 days is the maximum we can offer, Carol said. She said it with the particular gentleness of someone who has learned that honesty delivered kindly is better than kindness that misleads. After that, we can help you apply for transitional housing assistance. I want to be upfront with you about the current wait list. She paused. 8 months approximately. 8 months. Eleanor absorbed this number. She thanked Carol, who nodded with the nod of a person who has been thanked for difficult news many times and has learned that the thanks is not really for the news, but for the delivery of it. Eleanor found cot 47 and sat on it. The vinyl made it sound. She placed Raymond's photograph on the cot beside her, face up, so that he was looking at the ceiling instead of at her, which she felt he deserved, the ceiling being cleaner and less burdened than her face at this particular moment. She had $7.32 in the pocket of her house dress. In the other pocket, she had Raymond's Purple Heart and the 2 folded letters. These were her resources. She inventoried them the way she had always inventoried her resources, without sentimentality, looking at what actually existed rather than what she wished existed. The child 3 cots over had finally stopped crying and was asleep with the sudden totality of exhausted children. The elderly man to her left had settled into his coughing rhythm, the intervals between the fits long enough to offer hope and short enough to preclude sleep. She lay down and looked at the ceiling and thought. The ceiling was acoustic tile of the institutional variety, white, with small circular perforations in a regular pattern and water stains that had dried and re-dried over years into concentrically ringed formations, geological, in their layered record of repeated small disasters. She counted the perforations in the nearest tile without intending to count them, her mind looking for something regular and countable to organize itself around, while the larger thinking happened below the surface. 48 hours, less now, perhaps 36. She thought about Raymond building the basement, pouring concrete alone in August heat, working on weekends, and after work, building something that was designed to keep her alive during the worst of what Oklahoma skies could produce. She thought about the way he had not talked about Korea, the 27 years of marriage, in which the 14 months he had spent there occupied the space of a presence rather than an absence, felt rather than named real without being described. She had stopped waiting for him to tell her, sometime in the middle 70s, had come to understand that what he had lived there existed in him in a form that language couldn't reach. sealed in by something more than choice, by the impossibility of translation between that experience and ordinary life. She had loved what she could reach of him and respected the rest. She slept poorly, which was not unusual, which was simply her relationship with sleep at 80, a negotiation, more than a surrender. Something arrived at by degrees and held lightly. She woke twice to the child, and once to her own heart, the body conducting its nocturnal inventory of its own fragility. At 5:30, the shelter was already awake around her, in the partial way of shelters. Some people still horizontal, some moving, the smell of the coffee urn being started at the folding table near the entrance. Eleanor Rose washed her face in the bathroom that smelled of institutional soap, changed into the donated clothes that didn't fit, drank a cup of coffee that she could not improve with salt, because she had no salt, and thought about the day. There was one thing she could do. She could go back to the lot and see what could be salvaged before Monday's demolition crew arrived. Raymond's army blanket might be in the basement debris, the wooden box he had made for the metal, the coffee can on the kitchen shelf where she kept cash for emergencies, the shelf that no longer existed, but the can that might somewhere in the debris still intact. She did not tell Carol where she was going. She put Raymond's photograph and his medal in the pocket of the oversized sweater and walked out into the early morning. The 14 blocks were familiar in the way that routes walked hundreds of times become familiar. A knowledge in the body that doesn't require the mind's participation, feet finding the way while the mind goes elsewhere. The streets still carried debris from the storm branches and fragments of things displaced from their origins, but the essential geography was intact, the landmarks in their places. She turned onto her block. The lot had already been staked and taped. Orange construction tape on metal stakes around the perimeter, and at the front a sign in red letters that she read twice, then a third time. Hazardous structure. Demolition scheduled 0600 Monday. Keep clear. Riverside First National / Marsh Holdings, LLC. Marsh Holdings, LLC. She had known it from the letter. Seeing it on a sign staked into the ground of Raymond's front yard was different from reading it on paper. It made it real in a different register. Public official, the formal announcement of a private grievance translated into institutional language. She ducked under the tape. The debris field was different in the morning light, legible in new ways. The shock of the previous afternoon had made it overwhelming and undifferentiated. Now she could see the individual pieces, could read the debris the way you read any text once you know the language. Here was the kitchen cabinet, its doors blown off, its interior exposed like a book open to the middle. Here was the section of bathroom wall, still carrying the wallpaper she had hung in 1978, small yellow flowers on a white ground, flowers she had been meaning to replace for 20 years and would not now replace. Here was the aluminum body of Raymond's floor lamp bent around the oak tree at an angle that made it look like something growing. She worked methodically through the debris, lifting, examining, setting aside, or moving on. She found 3 photographs from the hallway wall glass broken, but images intact. She found the small ceramic cardinal her daughter had given her in 1993, chipped at the tail but whole in every essential way. She found the pewter candlestick Raymond had bought at an antique shop on their 20th anniversary, caked in mud but solid in the way that pewter things are solid when everything lighter has been blown away. She did not find the wooden box. She did not find the army blanket. She did not find the coffee can. She was on her knees in what had been the hallway, her hands muddy to the wrist, searching through a collapsed section of shelving when she found the journal. She almost missed it. It was wedged under a fallen shelf board, its cover dark with moisture and swollen from the water that had come through the destroyed roof during the storm. She had reached past it before something made her reach back, some peripheral awareness of density, of the specific weight of a book, and she pulled it out and held it in her muddy hands and looked at it. Raymond had kept a journal for a period of his early life. She had known this the way she knew many things about him, indirectly, by inference, by the trace evidence of a private interior she had never pushed against. She had found it once in a box when they moved into the finished house in 1971, the army green cover, the compact size of a journal meant to be carried in a breast pocket. She had held it for perhaps 30 seconds, feeling its weight, and then placed it back in the box without opening it, because she understood that it contained something he had chosen not to share. And she had believed, and continued to believe, that a person's unexpressed interior was their own. She had not thought about the journal for decades. She held it in her muddy hands in the ruins of Raymond's house and felt the weight of it, and felt the weight of the same decision presenting itself again wearing different clothes. 53 years had passed. Raymond had been gone for 32 of them. She opened it. The pages were damaged but legible. The ink smeared at the edges of some pages, others stuck together and requiring careful separation. She did not read it from the beginning. She turned through it the way you turn through something you're approaching cautiously, quickly glancing until she reached the last entry. The handwriting was Raymond's. She would have known it anywhere in any condition, the particular combination of legibility and impatience, as if his thoughts were always moving slightly faster than his hand, and the hand was perpetually catching up. September 14th, 1950. Punch Bowl. She read slowly. He wrote about the day without context, without explaining the military situation or the geography or the names that would later appear in history books. He wrote about what he had done the way a man writes when he is writing only for himself, with the directness that the absence of audience permits, without shaping or softening. There had been a vehicle. There had been fire. There had been a man inside who could not get himself out. Raymond had gotten him out. He wrote about it with a brevity so complete it approached the impersonal, as if the man who had run toward a burning vehicle under fire was a figure in a story he was reporting rather than a story he was living. As if courage to him was simply what you did when something needed doing, and you were the person present to do it, not worthy of commentary, barely worthy of record. The man's name appeared at the end of the entry, inserted casually between two other facts easily missed. Got Jimmy Decker out. Don't know if he'll make it. Hope he's got people at home waiting on him. Seemed like the kind of man who would. Eleanor read those 4 sentences twice. She sat in the mud of Raymond's debris field with his journal in her hands and read those 4 sentences until they had moved through her eyes and into the place where things that matter go, the place below, understanding where things become permanent. Seemed like the kind of man who would. Raymond Hayes had saved a man's life and written 4 sentences about it and sealed the journal in a box and never mentioned it to her in 27 years of marriage. Never mentioned it to anyone as far as she knew. Of course he hadn't. Of course. She pressed the journal against her chest and sat very still, and the morning was quiet around her, birds calling in the oak tree, the smell of post-storm earth in the air. Across the street, Vivian Marsh's front door opened. Eleanor did not look up immediately. She heard the door and the footsteps, and the sound of Vivian's voice carrying across the street, pitched at the volume of a woman performing for an audience she has arranged. Well, good morning. Vivian's voice had the quality of someone who has spent a long time learning to weaponize the conventions of politeness. I see you're back on the property. I believe the posted order says to keep clear. Eleanor did not respond. She closed the journal and placed it in the pocket of the sweater alongside the photograph and the medal. It's technically trespassing at this point, you know. Vivian's voice moved closer and Eleanor heard other footsteps, Tessa Nolan and someone else from further down the block gathering at the tape line. Vivian's kind of performance required witnesses always had. Some people just don't know when something is finished. I hate to say it. Truly. Tessa Nolan said nothing. Eleanor glanced at her and saw Tessa standing at the tape with her arms folded, her face arranged in the expression of someone who has made a specific decision not to become involved and is executing that decision with the discomfort of a person who knows the decision isn't right. Eleanor began to stand. Her knees expressed their detailed opinions about cold mornings and debris fields. She braced on a section of floor joist, rose to her full height, turned to face the street. God's judgment on poor decisions, Vivian said to the assembled audience. I hate to see it, but there are consequences to choices, Eleanor. You let those people into our neighborhood. You brought this on the whole block. One of the women further down laughed, a real laugh, small and quickly suppressed, but real. Eleanor looked at them. She looked at all of them, at Vivian, with her phone raised at Tessa, whose arms had tightened across her chest, at the woman who had laughed and was now studying the pavement. She looked at the houses behind them, unmarked, undamaged, a street that had survived intact except for the single lot where Raymond had built something that had held 26 people safe through the worst storm in 30 years. She picked up the ceramic cardinal. She picked up the 3 photographs in the pewter candlestick. She tucked them under her arm with care and walked to the tape and ducked under it without looking at Vivian, and walked down the block away from the sound of Vivian's voice continuing behind her, fading as distance accumulated between them. She walked back to the shelter. She sat on cot 47. She arranged Raymond's things on the cot beside her, the journal and the photograph and the medal and the salvaged items, and she looked at this small inventory of 53 years, and she did not cry. She had cried for Raymond the week he died in private in the bedroom with the door closed. Grief as a physical event, something that moved through her body with a force she hadn't anticipated. She had spent herself on grief that week and had not returned to it since. Not from the absence of feeling, but from the understanding that certain feelings are too large for casual revisitation, that you spend them once completely and then carry what remains in a different way. She was not going to cry now. She was going to think. She sat with what she had and thought with the methodical clarity of a woman who has spent 80 years addressing problems with available resources rather than necessary ones. She thought about what was coming and what could be done about it and what could not. What she did not know, sitting on cot 47 in the shelter on 5th Street, with 30-odd hours remaining before the demolition crew arrived, was what was happening 200 miles away in a town she had never visited, in a building she had never seen. She did not know about the phone call Cole Decker had made from the highway shoulder 40 minutes after leaving her street, the call made in the particular way that men who understand their audience make calls. No excess, no decoration, just facts arranged in the order that reveals their weight. Mrs. Hayes, 80 years old, house destroyed by the tornado. Neighbor had bought her mortgage to take the land. Bank accelerating the foreclosure. Living in a shelter. 48 hours left. She opened her basement door to 25 of our people without hesitation, while her own world was ending around her. She did not know about the calls that followed that call, the chapter presidents in Oklahoma City and Tulsa and Wichita Falls and Amarillo men, calling men who called other men, the story moving through the network with the velocity of something everyone immediately recognized as requiring a response. She did not know about James Decker's storage unit. Cole had driven there directly from the highway, the obligation pressing on him without yet having found its shape, the sense of something unfinished requiring him to go through his father's things for reasons he couldn't articulate. He had opened boxes in the fluorescent light of the storage unit with the particular focus of a man who is looking for something without knowing what he is looking for. His father's medals and discharge papers and the letters his grandmother had saved in the small collection of photographs. He found the envelope tucked inside a hardcover novel placed there with the deliberateness of something meant to be found. Inside was a photograph and a piece of folded paper covered in his father's handwriting. The photograph was black and white, aged to sepia, 2 young men in army fatigues near the wreckage of a military vehicle in a landscape that Cole recognized from other photographs as Korea. One of them was being pulled by the arm. The other was doing the pulling his body at the angle of effort and urgency, in complete commitment to the task. His face turned slightly toward the camera with an expression that was not heroic in any theatrical sense, not dramatic, not aware of itself. The face of a man doing a thing because the thing was in front of him to do. Cole knew his father's face at every age. He had grown up with it, watched it change over 6 decades. He knew it at 21, his father's age in 1950, and the young man being pulled from the burning vehicle was James Decker at 21, and the young man doing the pulling was not. The handwriting on the folded paper was cramped and urgent. The hand of a man writing something that mattered to him. Something he needed to put down in permanent form. Sergeant Raymond Hayes, his father had written. Punch Bowl, September 1950. Pulled me out of a burning vehicle when I couldn't get myself out. Rounds still coming in. Fuel tank about to go. Didn't hesitate for 1 second. I was alive when I should not have been alive because of this man. Below that, in different ink, a different day. 30 years looking, and I can't find him. If you find this and you know where he is, tell him James Decker has been grateful every single day since September 14th, 1950. Every single one, without exception. Below that, in a third ink, the handwriting of an older man, shakier and smaller, 2018. Still looking. Jimmy Decker, who should have died in Korea 74 years ago, but didn't because of Raymond Hayes. Still trying to say thank you. Cole sat in the storage unit for a long time with the photograph and the letter in his hands. He sat until the fluorescent light buzzed and flickered in its housing above him, and he understood what the obligation was, what form it had always been waiting to take, what 74 years of an unpaid debt looked like when it finally found its proper address. He called Walt Briggs at 2 in the morning. By 3, 1,200 people knew Eleanor Hayes's name. By 4, the number was close to 1,600. By the time the shelter lights came up at 6, the number was past 1,800, and growing men who had not been asked to come, but who understood without being told that this was the kind of thing you came for. Eleanor slept through all of it on cot 47 and woke at 6 to the shelter's institutional rhythms, and drank bad coffee and thought about the day and did not know. Carol Sims made her morning rounds and stopped at cot 47. "How are you holding up?" Carol asked. Eleanor considered how to answer this honestly within the constraints of a shelter morning conversation. "I've been worse," she said. This was true, and Carol received it with the nod of someone who understands that a person saying "I've been worse" is also saying "I'm still standing," which is its own kind of answer. Eleanor ate the shelter breakfast, powdered eggs and white toast and orange juice from a carton, and sat at one of the folding tables near the entrance, and thought about what 30 hours meant, and whether there was anything useful she could do with them. She was sitting with the empty tray in front of her and Raymond's journal on the table beside her coffee when the shelter door opened and cold air came in with a young woman who looked around, once found Eleanor, and came directly to her with the directness of someone who knows exactly where she's going. She was perhaps 30, with the particular brightness behind the eyes of a person running on purpose, rather than rest, who has been awake all night for reasons that mattered. She wore a jacket with a small iron covenant patch on the chest. Mrs. Hayes. She sat down across Eleanor without waiting to be invited, which Eleanor chose to read as directness rather than rudeness. "My name is Laura Decker. I'm Cole's daughter." Eleanor looked at this patch on her jacket, then at the young woman's face, finding in it something familiar that she couldn't yet place. "I drove from Tulsa through the night," Laura said. She placed a folder on the table between them. "I need you to see something." Eleanor opened it. Inside was a photograph reproduced large and clear, and beside it a piece of paper bearing handwriting that was not familiar, but that carried, even in reproduction, the quality of something written under the pressure of deep feeling. She looked at the photograph first. Two young men in army fatigues near a burning vehicle, one pulling the other free. She knew the face of the one doing the pulling, the way she knew Raymond's face in every decade of his life, by the bone structure beneath the expression, by the particular set of his jaw. She knew him at 22 from the portrait on her wall, and she knew him here at 22 in this photograph, doing something he had never told her about. She read the letter slowly. She read it 3 times. She had been reading Raymond's journal entry that morning in the debris field, had been carrying those 4 sentences in her memory with the fidelity of things read until they become permanent. She placed those 4 sentences against what James Decker had written over 30 years and in 3 different inks, and the 2 accounts fit together the way 2 pieces of a broken thing fit together, leaving no gap. "Jimmy Decker survived," Eleanor said. "He did," Laura said. "Lived to 90 years old." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were working to stay that way. "My grandfather wrote that letter 3 times over 30 years, every time he thought about it, every time he tried again to find your husband. He never found him." Eleanor put her hand flat on the table and looked at the photocopy of the photograph. "Raymond never told me," she said. "I don't think he thought it was worth telling." Laura paused. "From everything my dad says about him, from the letter, that sounds like who he was." Eleanor was quiet. The shelter moved around her, its morning business, the coffee urn, Carol Sims at the entrance, talking to a family, the elderly man to her left beginning his morning sequence of coughs. Then she reached into the pocket of the oversized sweater and placed Raymond's journal on the table open to the last entry and slid it across to Laura. She watched Laura Decker read. She watched the young woman's face in the moment the four sentences landed, watched her hand come up and cover her mouth, watched her eyes go bright and then brighter, watched her work to keep the composure she had come in carrying. He wrote about him, Laura said. Her voice had changed entirely. He wrote about my grandfather. He hoped your grandfather had people at home waiting for him, Eleanor said. Laura looked up. He did. He had my grandmother. He had my dad. He came home, and he had 68 more years, and he used all of them. She stopped. And he never stopped wanting to say thank you. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. Outside the shelter windows, the Sunday morning was cold and clear, the sky a hard and brilliant blue. What's happening out there? Eleanor asked. She said it directly looking at Laura, who had driven through the night for reasons that went beyond delivering information, and both of them knew it. Laura met her eyes. My dad is about 48 miles from here. He has a lot of people with him. She paused. There's a complication. This morning, very early. Eleanor listened. Vivian Marsh's attorney had filed an emergency motion the previous evening. Laura explained a petition to restrict public assembly within 500 feet of the property, citing public safety. The judge, a man named Whitmore, had signed it at 5 in the morning. The order was in effect. Eleanor received this information without visible reaction, placing it where it needed to go. So they can't come, she said. That's what Vivian Marsh believes, Laura said. There was something in the young woman's voice, measured and deliberate, that reminded Eleanor of Cole on her porch the previous morning, the quality of a person who knows something they have not yet said. Is there more? Eleanor asked. Laura looked at her watch. Our legal team has been working through the night, she said. They found something. Judge Whitmore has a documented financial relationship with Marsh Holdings, LLC. 2 investments, public record, both recent. She said it the way you say something that is both significant and thoroughly documented, so thoroughly documented that its significance requires no emphasis. That constitutes a conflict of interest. The order is invalid on its face. They filed the challenge with the federal court at 4:30 this morning. Eleanor was quiet. When does the federal court respond? She asked. We're expecting a ruling before 6 a.m., Laura said. The demolition is scheduled for 6. She paused. It'll be close. Eleanor sat with this. She sat with the precision of the timing, the narrow margin between the court's decision and the demolition crew's arrival, the mechanical indifference of schedules to the things happening around them. She sat with the image of Vivian Marsh signing the emergency motion with the satisfaction of a woman who has sealed the last exit, who has learned to use the machinery of the law the way she used everything else, as an extension of a private will. She thought about Raymond in Korea in September 1950, running toward a burning vehicle with rounds still incoming, not because he had calculated the odds or consulted his conscience or worked through any version of the ethics involved, but because there was a man who needed to be gotten out, and he was the man present to get him out. The kind of man who would. She thought about what she had done 5 days ago when 25 strangers had come to her door in the copper-green light with the sirens climbing and the birds gone silent. She had not consulted her conscience about that either. She had simply seen people who needed shelter, and she had shelter to give. It seemed to her, sitting on cot 47 with everything she owned in her pockets, that these things connected in a way that was not coincidence, not quite, but something more like the natural shape of things. The way water finds water, the way acts of a particular quality generate responses of the same quality across distances and years that should have made it impossible. Raymond had saved a man in Korea. The man had lived 68 more years and built a family and taught his son to fix engines and never stopped looking for the man who had made those 68 years possible. The son had ridden his motorcycle into a tornado on Eleanor Street. She reached into her pocket and closed her hand around the Purple Heart. Outside, the Sunday morning was cold and blue. 48 miles away on a highway she could not see headlights were moving through the last of the dark in numbers she could not have imagined. She held the metal and waited for morning to become what it was going to become. She did not sleep. She sat on cot 47 with Raymond's journal in her lap and the ceramic cardinal on the cot beside her, and she held the Purple Heart and she waited. The waiting had a particular texture to it that she recognized from other kinds of waiting. She had done the waiting beside Raymond's hospital bed in the hours before he died, when the doctors had been honest with her about what was coming. The waiting through the children's serious illnesses, when they were small and the night stretched out in front of her with no guaranteed morning attached to it. The waiting that has no action available to it, that is simply the experience of time passing while outcomes resolve themselves elsewhere, and you are not able to help it along. The shelter moved around her in the night, the coughing, the child's intermittent crying, the sounds of dozens of people in the various stages of restless sleep. Carol Sims moved through the room twice in the night with a flashlight held low checking, present the quiet vigilance of someone who takes her responsibility to these people seriously. Eleanor did not ask for anything. She sat with what she had. At 5:47 in the morning by the clock on the shelter wall, Laura Decker's phone lit up in her hand. She had been sitting across from Eleanor for the past hour, keeping the vigil with her, not talking much. Both of them understanding that the current moment didn't require conversation, just presence. She looked at the phone and Eleanor watched her face move through the moment before she spoke. Watched the expression change from held tension to something that was not quite relief but was in the direction of it. The face of someone who has been holding something very heavy and has just been given permission to set it down. "It's done," Laura said. Her voice was quiet in the sleeping shelter. "Judge Whitmore's order is vacated. Conflict of interest on the record." She looked up from the phone. They filed the mortgage purchase at the same time. Samuel Garrett signed at 7:45 last night. It's been recorded with the county clerk since 8 o'clock. Eleanor absorbed this. "The mortgage," she said. "Paid in full," Laura said. $114,000 cash. Riverside First National has no claim on the property. Marsh Holdings has no claim. The land is yours, Mrs. Hayes. Free and clear. No lien, no debt, nothing between you and it." Eleanor looked at the document visible on Laura's phone screen. The lines of legal text that represented the formal language of institutions, recording what had already happened, in a more essential sense, the shift in a reality that had been shifting since the moment Cole Decker had read his father's letter in a storage unit outside Tulsa. She thought about Vivian Marsh waking up this morning. She thought about Vivian going to sleep the night before with the satisfaction of a woman who believes she has won, who has filed her emergency motion and received her judge's order and closed the last door. How many, Eleanor asked. Laura knew what she was asking. 1,812, she said. 47 states. Eleanor sat with this number for a moment. Then she stood up from cot 47 for the last time and smoothed the sweater that still didn't fit and picked up Raymond's photograph in his journal and his medal and looked at the small collection of objects that had been her world for the past 2 days. She was ready. Carol Sims was at the door when Eleanor reached it with Eleanor's plastic bag of donated toiletries in her hand, holding it out, and then understanding and letting her hand drop. "You'll come back and tell me," Carol said. "I will," Eleanor said. The Red Cross van was at the curb. Laura held the door. Eleanor got in and the morning opened around them as they drove through streets that were Sunday quiet, inhabited rather than empty. The quiet of people inside who are warm and do not know yet what is coming to their neighborhood 2 miles away. What has been riding through the night from 47 states toward a single block in Oklahoma, toward a debt that is 74 years old. Eleanor heard them before she saw them. 14 blocks from the shelter with the windows up and the heater running, she felt them first the same way she had felt the tornado, a vibration that arrived in her chest through the seat in the floor of the van before it registered as sound, a frequency below sound that became sound as it grew. Laura glanced in the rearview mirror. Her expression was the expression of someone watching something they have been anticipating arrive and finding it larger than anticipation prepared them for. Eleanor turned in her seat and looked back through the rear window. The street behind them was filling. Not quickly, but with the inevitability of tides, the certainty of something that has been set in motion by enough people over enough distance that its arrival was decided before anyone on this block woke up this morning. Motorcycles came around the far corner in a column that did not end, rider after rider after rider in black leather with chrome catching the morning light and throwing it in fragments, the column filling the road from edge to edge. They rode with the precision of long practice, the unconscious coordination of a group that has covered enough miles together to move as one thing, the natural order of people who know each other's rhythms. They kept coming. Eleanor watched them come and felt something move through her that she couldn't name exactly, something that lived in the space between gratitude and awe, and the particular feeling of a person who has believed for a long time that they are fundamentally alone and has just been shown otherwise, not told shown, which is the only version of it that lands in the place where believing lives. The van turned onto her block. Vivian Marsh was on her porch. Eleanor saw her from the van window as they made the turn. Vivian standing with a coffee cup in both hands, the colonial house immaculate behind her, the yard still the most deliberately maintained yard on the street. She was looking toward the source of the sound with an expression that had not yet moved from confusion to understanding, the expression of a woman whose morning has not yet explained itself. The van stopped at the edge of what had been Raymond's lot. Eleanor opened the door herself. She stepped out onto the street, and the morning air hit her face cold and clean, and she stood beside the van and looked at the debris field and the orange tape and the demolition sign still on its post, still bearing Vivian's company name in its red letters. Behind her, the sound became everything. They came around the corner at the far end of the block in a column that seemed to have no end, filling the street as water fills a vessel completely from edge to edge, and they kept coming until this street was full, and the sound of adjacent streets filling carried to her on the morning air, the city expanding to accommodate something too large for a single road. Cole Decker rode at the front. She recognized him before she could see his face, recognized the particular way he sat on the machine, the ease of a man for whom motorcycles were simply the medium through which the world was moved. Through the decades of that ease settled into his posture. He came down the center of the block at the pace of ceremony rather than urgency. Everything already decided, and stopped in front of the lot. He raised his left hand. 1,800 engines shut off. The silence arrived all at once and pressed against her ears with the physical weight of its completeness. She had heard this quality of silence once before in the basement, in the 4 seconds after the tornado passed, when 26 people understood simultaneously that they were still alive. It had the same quality now, the quality of aftermath of things survived and accounted for, the specific silence that follows the specific sound of something very large ending. Cole swung off his bike and pulled off his helmet and stood with it under his arm, looking at Eleanor across the orange tape. Around the block, doors were opening. Eleanor watched them open one by one, the houses whose occupants had watched her stand in the ruins of her kitchen 2 days ago and had not moved. The Nolans, the Brannigans, old Mr. Kavanaugh from the end of the block, 82 years old, who had borrowed Eleanor's snow shovel every winter for 20 years. They came out onto their porches with the uncertain posture of people who know something is happening and don't yet know their relationship to it. Vivian Marsh had not moved from her porch. Her coffee cup was still in her hands, and she was looking at Cole with the expression of a person whose certainty has just encountered something it hadn't accounted for in its calculations. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he turned to face the street, all of it, the houses and the people on their porches, and spoke in the voice of a man who has learned to be heard across distances without raising his voice. My name is Cole Decker, President, Iron Covenant Motorcycle Club, Central Region. He let the name settle. We're here for Eleanor Hayes. Vivian's mouth opened, closed. 5 days ago, during the strongest tornado this state has seen in 30 years, Eleanor Hayes opened her basement door to 25 strangers. He did not raise his voice. The sentence didn't need it. She did it while her own house was being destroyed above her head, while her home was being taken from her by legal processes that some of you helped set in motion. He looked at the porches, at the faces on them, at Tessa Nolan with her youngest on her hip. She gave shelter when every single one of her neighbors closed their doors. The street was absolutely still. He looked at Vivian. "We know what you did," he said. "Not the petition. The other thing. The mortgage you purchased 6 months ago. The interest you allowed to accumulate to the point of default. The attorney you paid to file an emergency motion with a judge who had a documented financial relationship with your holding company." Vivian's face changed. "We have documentation on all of it," Cole said. "Our legal team has filed the relevant disclosures with the County Bar Association and the State Judicial Conduct Board. Judge Whitmore's order has been vacated by federal court ruling issued at 5:47 this morning." He produced a folded document from his jacket. Walt. Walt Briggs stepped forward, heavy-set and deliberate, carrying a folder that he opened and held toward the street without theatrics. "The mortgage on this property was purchased from Riverside First National Bank at 7:45 last night," Cole said. "$114,000 cash, recorded with the county clerk at 8 o'clock this morning." He looked directly at Eleanor. "Mrs. Hayes, this land is yours, free and clear. No debt, no lien, no claim from any party. Yours the way it was always meant to be yours." Eleanor stood very still on the street. She had known it was coming. Laura had told her in the shelter. But knowing a thing as information and receiving a thing as reality are different experiences, occupy different spaces in the body, and she stood in the morning light and received it. Vivian Marsh stepped off her porch. She crossed her yard with the purpose of a woman who has not yet accepted the new dimensions of the situation, who is still operating on yesterday's certainties. She stopped at the edge of her property and put her chin up and set her voice tight. "This is not legal. What you have done is not legal. You cannot purchase a debt without proper notice to all parties, and I have attorneys who will—" "They'll want to read the conflict of interest disclosure first," Cole said. He said it without particular inflection, without satisfaction, as a statement of fact. Judge Whitmore's financial relationship with Marsh Holdings, LLC, is now public record. Your attorneys will advise you about the implications." He paused. "You have no legal recourse, Mrs. Marsh." Vivian's mouth closed. The silence that followed this was different from the engine silence. This one had the particular quality of a public moment in which a person is seen clearly for the first time, in which the story they have told about themselves meets the story everyone else has been watching. Eleanor looked at Vivian's face and watched the certainty that had sustained 15 years of grievance encounter the limits of what certainty can sustain, and she felt not satisfaction, but something closer to sorrow. The specific sorrow of watching someone discover that the accounting they have been doing privately does not match the ledger that exists outside themselves. The Red Cross van had pulled to the curb behind the motorcycles. Carol Sims had come around the front and was standing with her hands in her jacket pockets, watching. Tessa Nolan stepped off her porch. She crossed the street with her youngest on her hip, walked through the gap in the orange tape, and stopped in front of Eleanor. Her face was doing what faces do when people have been holding something too long and have finally decided to put it down regardless of what it costs them to set it down. "Mrs. Hayes," her voice was not steady, "you babysat my kids for 8 months when I lost my job. You never asked me for anything. You never mentioned it to anyone. You never made me feel like I owed you." She stopped and started again. "I signed that petition. I signed it because everyone else was signing it, and I signed it without thinking, and I have thought about nothing else since the day of the storm." She stopped. "I'm so sorry." The words came out without rhetorical structure, without the architecture of an apology that is also a request for absolution. Just the bare thing itself offered without expectation of what it would receive. Eleanor looked at her. She looked at this young woman who had played in front of this house when she was 7 years old in little red sneakers with Velcro straps, whose face Eleanor had watched change over 20 years. She put her hand against Tessa's cheek. "You're forgiven," she said, simply without decoration, the way she said things that were true and didn't require more than the truth. "That's over," Tessa cried. Real tears, the kind that have been held for a while and have built up pressure, the release of something that was heavier than she'd known until she put it down. Eleanor kept her hand against her cheek for a moment and then let it drop. One by one, the rest of the block came. Old Mr. Kavanaugh came down from his porch with his cane moving slowly and deliberately toward the lot. The Brannigans came together, the husband carrying tools, having apparently thought about what he might be needed for, and come prepared. Neighbors Eleanor had fed and watched over and been present for across decades came across the street with the tentative approach of people who don't know what reception they will receive and have decided to come anyway, which is the only way that kind of coming happens. None of them went to Vivian. Vivian Marsh stood at the edge of her property and watched her neighborhood reorganize around her. Watched the arrangement she had spent 15 years constructing dissolve in a single morning, and Eleanor could see in the set of her body the experience of a person whose world has been organized around a particular story and has just watched that story become untenable. The coffee cup was still in her hands, the coffee long cold, and she was holding it the way people hold things when they need something to hold. Eleanor looked at her for a moment, then she looked away. Not from cruelty, from the understanding that what Vivian was accounting for was between Vivian and herself and would take longer than this morning. Cole came to stand beside Eleanor. He was carrying something in his right hand held against his leg, carried with the particular care of something that has been kept a long time and has become important through keeping. He came to stand in front of her with the posture of a man who has been preparing for a moment and has arrived at it and is finding it larger than preparation was able to account for. "Ma'am," he said. He stopped. Eleanor waited. He raised his right hand and held out the photograph. It was in a protective archival sleeve, clear and rigid, preserving it behind a surface that kept time from reaching it. She could see it clearly through the sleeve. Black and white, the resolution of military photography from 1952 young men near the wreckage of a vehicle in a Korean landscape. She knew Raymond's face at every age. She knew it from their wedding photograph and from the portrait she had carried from the wall of the destroyed house, and from 32 years of holding his face in her memory with the fidelity that long love builds, the fidelity of someone who has memorized something precious because they understand it is precious and will not always be there. She knew his face at 22 from the portrait that had hung on her hallway wall, and she recognized it here immediately in the angle of his jaw and the particular set of his shoulders, in the way his body was oriented entirely toward the man he was pulling free. He was reaching with both arms, his body at the angle of effort, his face turned slightly toward the camera with an expression that was not heroic in any theatrical sense, not aware of its own significance, not performing. It was the face of a man doing the thing that was in front of him to do with the complete attention of someone for whom the present moment has become the only moment. His hands were on another man's arm. "Jimmy Decker," she said. Cole's voice, when it came, was working around something. "My grandfather," he said. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor held the photograph in both hands. The morning light was full on it now, clear and cold, and she could see the details with the clarity that matters brings, the texture of the fatigues, the ground, the hills, and the background of a country her husband had never talked about. "For 74 years, Cole said, between my grandfather looking and then me carrying what he left unfinished, this family has been looking for Raymond Hayes." His voice was careful and deliberate around the words. "My grandfather died 4 years ago. He was still looking." Eleanor looked at the photograph. She reached into the pocket of the sweater. She took out Raymond's journal, its cover still marked by the mud of the debris field, and she held it for a moment before she opened it. She knew the page. She turned to it without searching, the way you turn to something you have read until you know where it lives. She held it out to Cole. He took it with both hands. He read it. She watched his face as he read Raymond's 4 sentences, the last entry in the journal. The account of September 14th, 1950, written in Raymond's impatient hand that was always catching up with his thoughts. The 4 sentences that had sat in a journal in a box for 74 years without anyone reading them. She watched Cole Decker read "Got Jimmy Decker out," and she watched what happened in his face when those words arrived. He looked up. His eyes were very bright. "He wrote about him," Cole said. He hoped your grandfather had people at home waiting for him, Eleanor said. He did. Cole's voice was almost inaudible. He had my grandmother. He had my dad. He had 68 more years, and he used every single one of them. He built things. He taught my dad to fix anything that could be fixed. He had 8 grandchildren, and he knew every one of their birthdays and what they were afraid of and what made them laugh. He paused. He used every one of those years. His voice stopped working for a moment, and he never stopped wanting to say thank you. They stood together on the street, Eleanor Hayes and Cole Decker, with the photograph between them and the journal between them, and 74 years of an unpaid debt between them and around them. 1,812 people stood in complete silence on a Sunday morning in Oklahoma, understanding without being told that this moment required their stillness, required the space that only silence provides. Cole's composure finished. It finished the way things finish in real life rather than in performance. Not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet yielding, the progressive release of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and has reached the natural end of his capacity to hold it. He put one hand over his eyes and stood with his shoulders moving, and Eleanor reached up and put her small hand against his arm, the thin skin of her hand against the leather of his jacket, and felt the shaking move through him. 1,800 people stood still and did not look away. There were others crying. She could hear it around her, the soft sounds of people move past their own reserves, but she kept her attention on Cole, on this man who had ridden through the night, carrying his grandfather's photograph toward a debt that had been waiting since before he was born. After a while, he lowered his hand. His face was red and entirely unashamed about being red, which told her something about the kind of man he was. "My dad is going to hear about this," he said. His voice was rough and direct and certain. Eleanor looked at him with all the certainty she had, which was considerable. "Your dad and Raymond are together right now," she said. She said it the way she believed it, which was completely and without reservation. "Probably sharing a drink and laughing at all this fuss we're making over them." Cole made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else. "Raymond would have called this excessive," Eleanor said. She felt something she needed a moment to identify, the warm quality of amusement that only comes from knowing someone well enough to know exactly how they would respond to something, the amusement of absolute intimacy. He was the least fussy man who ever lived. He would have said, "You could have just mailed a card." Cole laughed, a real laugh, sudden and full, surprised out of him by the accuracy of the image. Around them, she heard the same quality of release moving through the assembled crowd, the sound of held breath finally finding its exit tension, releasing into something lighter. Walt Briggs came forward with practical efficiency. He was the kind of man who understood that important moments needed to be followed by important action, or they dissolved into pure sentiment, which was not what they were for. "Mrs. Hayes." He opened the folder. "Sandra Keller is our architect. She's been working through the night. She'd like to show you something when you're ready." A woman came forward from the group, perhaps 50, with the calm and deliberate movements of someone accustomed to translating vision into structure, someone for whom drawings were simply the language of intention made visible. She carried plans under her arm and set up a portable table that 2 others materialized to unfold, and she unrolled the plans on the surface with the ease of long practice. Eleanor looked at the drawings. The footprint was Raymond's. She recognized it before she consciously understood that she was recognizing it, the recognition happening in the body first, in the specific knowledge of someone who has moved through a space for 53 years until the space and the body know each other, who has navigated it in the dark without thinking. The same arrangement of rooms, the same front door in the same position, the same relationship between the kitchen and the backyard. But the structure inside the familiar form was different, and Sandra Keller explained it without the enthusiasm of a salesperson, with the directness of someone describing decisions made for reasons that were clear. The foundation reinforced beyond current code. The walls framed to withstand an EF5. The roof structure doubled. A storm shelter in the basement with reinforced concrete walls and a steel door rated for Category 5 conditions. "Same house," Sandra said. built to outlast anything the Oklahoma sky can produce for the next 100 years. Eleanor looked at the drawings for a long time at the room that had been Raymond's study, in the same corner with the same dimensions, in the same window, looking out at the backyard where he had grown tomatoes every summer, until the summer he couldn't anymore. "How did you know where the window was?" Eleanor asked. Sandra looked at her. "Tessa Nolan," she said. She had photographs of the house from a neighborhood archive she'd been keeping since 2015. She drove to Tulsa at midnight to bring them to us. Eleanor looked across the debris field to where Tessa stood with her daughter on her hip. Tessa looked back, and the look between them was one of those looks that contain more than looks usually carry, that compress into a glance the weight of the whole complicated human story that had been living between them for the past 5 days. The work began. It began not gradually, but all at once, with the coordinated efficiency of people who have planned carefully and are now executing the plan without hesitation. Trucks that had been staged 2 blocks away, pulling forward with lumber and materials and equipment. Licensed contractors moving directly to their tasks, with the focus of people who have agreed to give their time completely and are honoring that agreement. Within an hour, the demolition tape was down and the debris was being sorted, salvageable from waste, with a care that Eleanor recognized as deliberate people pausing over things before deciding, not rushing the decision. She watched a man in his 30s stop over a section of wallboard and examine it and set it carefully to the side. She understood he was looking at the wallpaper, the small yellow flowers she had hung in 1978 and been meaning to replace for 20 years. He had decided it deserved to be kept. Eleanor sat in a chair that appeared beside her, without her requesting it, carried by invisible hands to the position where she could see the work, and she watched. The neighbors worked alongside the Iron Covenant volunteers, without the awkwardness she might have anticipated. The Brannigan husband worked next to a man from Tennessee, both of them running lumber, developing the wordless coordination of people engaged in physical work toward a shared purpose, the communication of bodies rather than words. Old Mr. Kavanaugh, who could not do the heavy work, organized the salvage pile with the methodical attention of a man who had decided this was his contribution and intended to give it everything. Vivian Marsh was not there. She had gone inside sometime during Cole's address to the street, the door closing with a quietness that was, in retrospect, the most significant thing Vivian had done all morning. The days that followed had a quality Eleanor had not anticipated, the quality of community, in the most literal sense, people working together towards something they had all agreed mattered, the warmth that this specific activity generates and that no other activity quite replicates. The street became a different place in those 14 days. People who had lived beside each other for years and known each other's names but not much else learned the other things, the information that accumulates when people share hours and physical work, and the particular vulnerability of trying hard at something in front of others. Tessa Nolan was there every day. She brought her children and her photographs and her willingness to be useful in whatever way was needed, and she made herself indispensable in ways that were quiet and consistent, which was the best kind of indispensable. Eleanor watched her working and thought about the 7-year-old in the red sneakers, and thought about how people are not the worst things they do, and about how the opportunity to act differently is the most important thing you can offer someone who has acted badly. Sandra Keller worked alongside her crew with the precision of someone for whom this project had become personal rather than professional, coming to Eleanor twice a day with questions, small specific questions about placement and height and color, that were less about architecture than about memory, about getting the remembered thing exactly right. She came on the 9th day with a paint sample card, and Eleanor looked at it for a long time. "That's it," she said. The yellow Raymond had chosen in 1971 after 3 tries. The particular yellow that Eleanor had always thought of as the color of late afternoon light on good days was reproduced on a 2-inch square of cardboard. It was exactly right. On the 12th day, Vivian Marsh appeared. Eleanor saw her from her chair at the edge of the lot. Vivian came from her house and crossed her yard and stood at the edge of the work zone with her hands folded in front of her and watched without speaking to anyone. She stood that way for 20 minutes. Then she picked up a water jug from the supply table at the perimeter and walked to where two men were working on interior trim and set it down beside them without a word and went back for another one. Nobody said anything to her. She worked quietly through the afternoon, carrying water and supplies present and useful and silent. She was there the next day and the day after. Eleanor watched her and thought about the $3,000 she had given Vivian on a gray February afternoon 15 years ago. She thought about what it costs a person to be unable to receive kindness without feeling diminished by it, the long exhaustion of that way of living. She did not speak to Vivian, not yet. Some things needed more time than 14 days. On the 14th day, Sandra declared the exterior complete. Eleanor stood across the street and looked at it. The yellow was exactly right in the afternoon light, exactly the warmth Eleanor remembered the quality Raymond had worked toward through 3 attempts, until he found the one that said what he wanted it to say about what lived inside, about what the house was for. The porch was rebuilt to his original design, the railing at the angle he had calculated, the boards cut to the width he had preferred, but with steel hidden inside the wood where no one could see it. The strength of what they now knew supporting the form of what he had always intended. She looked at it for a long time. That evening, Cole sat beside her on the bench that had appeared in the first week and remained. My dad used to say, Cole said, that the hardest thing in the world was to let people help you. He said most people would rather fail alone than ask for what they need. Raymond was like that, Eleanor said. He would have been uncomfortable with all of this. She looked at the house, at the yellow that was the right yellow. He would have been grateful in a way he couldn't quite express, and then he would have found something practical to do with his hands, so he didn't have to try to express it. Cole smiled. My grandfather, too. There was a quiet between them. Raymond never told me what he did in Korea, Eleanor said. 32 years together, and he never said. She looked at the house. He built a house instead. She paused, the thought arriving as she said it. He built a basement that held 26 people through a tornado. Cole looked at the house with her. He told you, Cole said, just not in words. The morning of the 15th day came in cold and clear, the sky the hard blue of real November, the season that comes after the season of disasters, the season that requires a different kind of endurance. Cole opened the front door. Eleanor stood on the rebuilt porch with her hand on the railing, feeling the solidity of it under her palm, the solid certainty of wood that has steel inside it. She could feel the intention of the people who had put the steel there, the decision they had made about what this place deserved to be able to withstand. She crossed the threshold. The smell of new wood was everywhere, clean and resinous, the smell of things recently made. And beneath it, something she could not have described to anyone, but that she recognized immediately, the atmospheric signature of a space that corresponds to some interior geography she had been carrying and would continue to carry, the recognizable quality of a place that is hers. The kitchen was exactly right. The window above the sink at the same angle, the same morning light arriving through it and falling on the same section of wall. The hook beside the back door at the same height in the same position. She had not told anyone about the hook, had not mentioned it to Sandra or to Laura or to anyone. And here it was, as if Sandra had simply understood that beside every back door in every house, lived with long enough by a particular person, there are specific things that are so integral to the space that to omit them would be to omit something of the person who lived there. She walked through the hallway. The family photographs were on the wall. The originals cleaned and reframed in their same positions, the same order, the same height Raymond had established when they first went up in 1989. She stopped in front of his army portrait, 22 years old, before Korea, before the things he didn't talk about, before the house and the years and the life they built together in the specific and unrepeatable way that two particular people build a life. She touched the frame. The living room held Raymond's reading chair. It was not the original. The original was somewhere in the debris field of the first days reclaimed by the storm that had also taken the kitchen and the roof and the walls. This was a reconstruction of such precision that she would not have known the difference from the inside of knowing the same proportions, the same fabric in the same color, the same slight angle to the left, that Raymond's body had achieved over years of sitting in exactly the same way, in exactly the same place. Reproduced here by someone who had understood from a photograph that the angle was not incidental. She sat in it. It held her the way it had always held her, the specific reception of a chair that has been shaped by one person and offered to another, carrying in its structure the memory of a particular body. She sat in it and looked at the room, and the room looked back at her with the familiarity of a face she knew. On the mantel, Raymond's Purple Heart. Sandra had made a case for it, glass-fronted, lit from within by a small warm light that illuminated the metal without overwhelming it. The ribbon was clean. The brass caught the light. The profile of Washington was visible in every detail she had read so many times she saw it with her eyes closed. Beside it, in a matching case of the same dimensions, another Purple Heart. Eleanor rose from the chair and went to the mantel and looked at it. James Decker's medal. Cole had placed it there without asking her, understanding that it belonged here the way you understand things that are simply true, that require no argument, that are obvious once someone has placed them in front of you. Two medals from the same war, from the same month, of the same year, on the same mantel, in the same house. The men who had earned them would have said it was too much, would have found something practical to do with their hands so they didn't have to stand still in the presence of it. She looked at them for a long time. On the kitchen table was a book, bound in dark leather, the cover embossed simply Iron Covenant. She opened it. The pages were full of handwriting, not typed or printed. Handwriting, each entry in a different hand, the visual record of individuals making individual marks, each one different from all the others. The particular diversity of human handwriting, that is one of the ways the particular human being is visible in the general human act. She turned pages slowly. Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes. You showed us what it looks like to choose right when it costs you something. Danny Alcott, Amarillo chapter. Sergeant Raymond Hayes gave my grandfather 68 more years of life. You gave us shelter when the sky came apart. We don't have the words for what we owe you except to be here. Cole Decker. I was in that basement. I was 25 years old, and I was the most afraid I have ever been, and you held my hand and told me to think about something beautiful. I will never forget that. Danny Alcott. She had not known Danny had written twice. She held the book and looked at his name written twice, and thought about his hands shaking in the basement, and the rings rattling against each other, the involuntary percussion of a young man's fear. She turned more pages. The handwriting changed with every entry, men and women she had never met, and would mostly never meet, each one writing, because they needed to say something, and this was the form that was available for saying it. Your husband saved a man's life in 1950. That man built a family. That family built more families. There are hundreds of people alive today because of one act by one man who didn't think it was worth mentioning. We're mentioning it now. Iron Covenant, Oklahoma City chapter. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with the book in her hands and read for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor in its familiar arc. The sun's position translated through the window above the sink into a moving brightness that she had been marking time by for 53 years, without deciding to the way you mark time by things that are constant and present and don't demand that you pay attention. When she looked up, Cole was in the doorway. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and his helmet under his arm, the look of a man who has completed the thing he set out to do and is now in the particular quiet that follows. Completion, the quiet that is different from ordinary quiet because it is earned. Your father spent 30 years looking for Raymond, Eleanor said. Cole nodded. She looked at the book and then back at him. Raymond spent 20 years building this house, she said. She said it slowly, letting the thought arrive as she spoke it. He built it for me. But I think he also built it because he didn't know what else to do with what he carried from that day. She paused. Maybe the house was also for Jimmy Decker. Maybe it was the only way he knew to say that it mattered. That the man he pulled out of the fire deserved to have someone still here, still standing, still building things. Cole was very still in the doorway. Eleanor looked at him. She thought he had the quality of his grandfather in him in ways she couldn't have explained except that she felt it, The quality of a man formed by a particular kind of experience and a particular kind of example into someone who understands without needing to be told that some things are worth riding a long way for. Your grandfather would have liked this house, she said. Cole cleared his throat. He would have wanted to help build it, he said. He did help build it, Eleanor said. She looked at the two medals on the mantel. He built it in September 1950 when Raymond came home alive. He just didn't know that's what he was doing. Outside, she could hear the last of the motorcycles starting up the Iron Covenant members, beginning the long rides home to 47 states. The sound of departure that was not the sound of ending, but of continuation of people returning to their lives carrying something additional, something that would inform how they move through the world in ways they might not be able to name, but would feel in the moments when they are standing at a door deciding whether to open it. She stood and walked to the back door and opened it. The yard was bare earth in November light. She would plant tomatoes in the spring. Raymond had grown tomatoes every summer in the same corner, the same variety purchased from the same supplier, tended with the same methodical care he gave everything he considered worth caring for. She would plant them in the same corner. The light was right there. He had known that from the first summer and had been right about it every summer since. Cole came to stand beside her in the doorway. The yard was quiet. The street behind them was quieting as the last engines faded. The afternoon was very clear and cold, and the light on the bare earth had the quality of November light, the quality of things preparing rather than ending the necessary dormancy before the next season's work begins. Your grandfather looked for Raymond for 30 years, Eleanor said. Cole listened the way some people listen with the whole body. I looked for Raymond for 32 years, she said. In this house, in the places where he had been, in the space at the kitchen counter where he used to stand. She paused. I think I found him today. She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't need to. Cole stood beside her in the doorway of Raymond's rebuilt house, and they looked at the bare yard in the November light, and the silence between them was the comfortable silence of people who are holding the same thought. After a long while, he said quietly, I think my grandfather found him too. Eleanor nodded. She put her hand in her pocket and closed it around the Purple Heart, feeling the familiar shape of it, the weight that was always slightly less than she expected, and always exactly more than it seemed. The yard waited. The spring was months away. There was time.